as you said, I'll be talking about Endtoend, which was my essentially main project during my 10-month-ish internship at Rasa. And my hope is through this presentation to show you kind of two at one. One is Endtoend and it as a new feature of Rasa, but also I think it's a good showcase example of how quickly, comparatively, things go in Rasa from a small kind of project at the corner of a table to a full-on experimental feature. So what I'll be talking about is what is Endtoend, what we are actually kind of talking about, why we started working on it and why we started talking about it now, and then how the whole research proceeded and what happened after. I have to say that whenever I say we within this presentation, it means more Rasa team, and I was a part of Rasa team for most of this journey, but not for all of it. So it is Rasa team, irrespective of with me or without me on board. What is, I don't know, does screen sharing work still? Yes, good. Sorry, there was some glitch. So when we talk about Endtoend, I think it's good to put it in a context of traditional conversation AI, which probably everyone who is here has had some experience with. And the traditional pipeline looks just like this, where your input is user text. And then it goes first through your first modal, which is natural language understanding, which understand what was the user intent and what the user wanted. Your second modal, which comes next in that pipeline, is dialog manager, which predicts what the next action the bot should take. And then your third modal is response selector, which decides what is the surface form, which is sometimes text, sometimes images, or like, I don't know, buttons, which this next action should take. But when we are talking end-to-end, which ends do we mean is actually connecting the two ends of this pipeline, going directly from user text on the left to bot response on the right. And when we look at it from the modeling point of view, what it means that we are essentially getting rid of the three modals that I listed and just using one modal to go directly from the user text to the response of the bot. And although it might sound very tempting that instead of training three modals, you just use one, I don't think I'm in any position to say just let's throw out 30 or 40 years of research and practice and just change all of it. So I'll tell you what I think are the most important advantages and disadvantages of being both in a pipeline and using end-to-end. So one advantage which I've mentioned is that you have one modal instead of three, which means that sometimes you might have less parameters this way, and this might help sometimes. Another benefit, which I think is one of the most important, is that you need much less manual labor. You don't need to annotate every single user utterance with an intent. You don't need to find what the slots are and which words correspond to each slot. You don't need to come up with action labels, and sometimes this manual labor is pretty tedious. So you might want to avoid it. And the third main benefit is that your actual training data is much more legible. It looks something like this, which to me always reminds those dialogues in I don't know, in books or in plays, where you know what each character said, and you know exactly which text they meant, rather than using some of those more abstracted representations such as intents or action names. But surely these advantages don't come without the other side of the coin. And yes, on one hand, this data is much more legible, but also to have a good end-to-end model which works, we need loads of those data. We need loads of dialogues. And that is required to make sure that our model is actually capable of generalizing to something it hasn't seen within that training data. And covering all those combinations grows exponentially the more options you've seen, essentially. On the other hand, because the model is end-to-end and it is mapping directly user utterance to the next bot response, it means that we have much less control and we can't really explain why the model outputs one thing over the other in different contexts. And that can be pretty dangerous when we think about real life applications where in some context the same phrase which is totally fine in one place will be rude and insulting to someone in another. So when we started working on end-to-end, we had all of those disadvantages and advantages at once. And there was a blog post which said that maybe we are not yet ready for unsupervised learning in end-to-end. But at the same time, a bit more than a year ago, Alan wrote a blog post about how it was time to start getting rid of intents within chatbots. I think it is important to say, so Alan, I refer you to that blog post for all the reasons why sometimes intents are a bottleneck. And why having, those hard assigned classes would be negative and kind of constraining. But what I'll say is that I think why now is the time is because now chatbots are started to be used more in the wild, where they face the user more. And that means that the conversation AI developers face more and more of the situations where what the user says doesn't quite fit into any of the intents that you've assigned or that you've imagined, or that assigning one user utterance to one intent would ruin another one. To give you an example of this, I'll give you these two dialects, which go exactly the same in the beginning, where user and bot greet each other. User is searching for a restaurant, and bot suggests a cuisine. Let's say it was Thai cuisine. And then in here, the user says, on the left, the user says, I had that yesterday. And both you and I understand that as like human natural language understanding algorithms, we understand that I had that yesterday probably means no, and that probably the bot should suggest a different cuisine. But in an example on the right, the user says, I had that yesterday, but I'm always up for Thai, which means that the bot can proceed and can offer a place to go to. However, if we imagine that we had to assign these sentences to hard-defined intents, we realize that if we assign I had that yesterday to deny intent, then most probably when the modal encounters, I had that yesterday, but I am always up for tie, it will also classify it as a deny intent, although it isn't, and the other way around. So we knew that the task is hard and that there are a lot of disadvantages to it, but well, the challenge is real and the challenge was accepted. I think here it's important to give you an overview of what our research process included. So first we did a bit of research in a very raw fashion. And then if the research was successful, we would think about integrating it into the whole Rasa framework. And then once that is done, we would happily welcome the users to use Endtoend as an experimental feature. And that's the way we went. As I said, the first step was researching Endtoend as a raw idea, and we started with this very kind of, in a way, paper or like academia like way of going about it. We took a big data set called multi-was, widely used in dialogue systems community, and ran the model we developed on multi-was. And the results we got looked surprisingly good, I would say. I'm not giving you the numbers here because if I gave you the numbers, then there will be a lot of baselines to explain. But if you're interested, I'm very happy to explain all of the actual experiments we did. So after we got these promising results, we started to think about, well, if we have that, then we have to actually consider what could be the way of using it within Rasa. And we started going through the steps through which our users would go through. So we took a bot called Sarah, which I think you might have encountered if you've looked at Rasa documentation and started trying to get rid of intents and essentially retraining it and chatting with it as our users who come for documentation would. And what we saw was that it performed at least not worse, and in some cases actually better than when it was trained in modular fashion. That was pretty inspiring, and I'm not going to lie, I think a lot of people would be much happier if this stage went a bit worse, because then we wouldn't need to think about how do we actually bring it into reality. But it went better than we expected. So we started thinking about what does it mean to integrate it into Rasa framework. And as I said, I don't think that it's already the time to just throw out everything we had before and do this radical change of let's just all go end to end and be happy with that. I think it was so we started thinking about how can we integrate what we had before, but with the end-to-end, and what is it that we actually want to achieve with having it. So I'll explain what we wanted to achieve with the examples of three training stories that we have. One is, I'll go from left to right. So the left one is your usual Rasa story. If you've ever written one, it always goes from intents to actions. And I call it usual old format, but it is just normal, regular Rasa story as it used to look like always. Then the one in the middle is somewhat like a mix of having some text, but also some intents and actions. And as you see here, most of it is exactly like the story on the left, but there is just one user phrase inserted. And then the left one is the fully end-to-end format, where everything is text and it looks just like the what every person said. So we imagine that in a perfect future world, we would have some way of having all of those included into Rasa. And I'll show you how we actually integrated on an example of a mixed dialogue. So here you see mixed dialogue where previously user and bot greeted each other, and there was intent greet and intent search restaurant recognized by the NLU model, and our dialogue policy predicted the actions utter green and utter suggest cuisine. What do we know from seeing this sort of dialogue already? We know that we have had at least some NLU data that map texts to intents, and this in turn means that there was an NLU model which was trained, which can predict those intents. At the same time, we know that we have end-to-end stories, so the dialogue policy would be able to take text into account during prediction. How does the prediction proceed in this case? So firstly, our NLU model will predict an intent for the user message. Let's say for this case, it predicts the intent search restaurant. Then our dialogue policy takes the whole context into account, but unlike previously, it can look not only at search restaurant, but also at the text, I'm always up for sushi. And at this point, dialogue policy is empowered to make a decision of that the intent doesn't have any useful information, and it can predict the next action directly from the text, I'm always up for sushi. What do we get with having this model or this process? First thing that we get is that we make intents optional. You don't have to assign every single user utterance that your model encounters to an intent you've predefined. And at the same time, we have a very powerful dialogue policy, which can be trained on intents, action names, text of phrases, and any mix of those. I feel I don't think it will be an overstatement to say that I have not seen a policy like that before, and I haven't seen an algorithm like this before or after. I have to say that between coming up with it and it being ready, there were a couple of turns of the spiral of this is a beautiful idea, but it's technically infeasible, and then that's technically beautiful, but doesn't work the way we like. But at the end of that spiral, where we are now, I think everyone at Rasa is pretty happy to welcome the users to use end-to-end as an experimental feature within Rasa, starting from Rasa 2.2, and I hope that you give us, but I'm a bit confused when I'm saying this because I'm not at Rasa anymore and I won't get your feedback, but I think everyone will be happy for useful feedback on end-to-end. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to get any questions, but if there will be anything I won't answer, you can find me anywhere.